Hello there. The calls within the European Union for the formation of an EU army are increasing fast, and Italy has just joined in. The Italian Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister Antonio Tajani has called for the formation of an EU army and accepted that it would mean EU member states having to surrender some more sovereignty to achieve it, reports Breitbart. Tajani told the Italian newspaper La Stampa, "If we want to be bearers of peace in the world, we need a European army. And this is a fundamental precondition for having an effective European foreign policy. In a world with powerful players like the United States, China, India and Russia, with crises ranging from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, Italian, German, French or Slovenian citizens can only be protected by something that already exists, and it's called the European Union." And there you have it. The EU army will soon come about. Because people like Tajani do not speak as lone voices. They talk about these things publicly like our Westminster lot do to prepare the people for announcements to follow. And I will point out that he said that having an EU army, by that I take it he means the full Navy, Army and Air Force setup, that by having that, he says it will allow the EU to have an effective foreign policy. Meaning, foreign policy will also be taken totally under the EU Brussels-held umbrella. Sounds like EU member state governments are about to become nothing more than EU town councils. Just what the Ramonas will want to hear. And get this, his boss, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, must also surely share her Deputy PM's views. Or is this his view as the leader of one of Italy's coalition government parties, Forza Italia? And therefore he's in a position where he can speak his own mind without fear of repercussions from Meloni, maybe. Tajani also told La Stampa, "Therefore, defence and a common army must become a concrete fact, no longer postponable. National resistance to sharing even these pieces of sovereignty will always be strong. But if we remain divided, we will always be defenceless sparrows in a world where eagles fly." But no mention of NATO. It seems the push is for an all-EU-only set of armed forces. But how to form them is the question. But actually, that's the easier bit, something I'll come on to in a moment. Now, Tajani also said that the two jobs of President of the EU Commission and President of the EU Council should be merged so that European leadership, as he refers to it, will emanate from one single person, as well as urging for national vetoes to be removed in some big policy areas, like defence and foreign policy. Also as to speed up decision-making. But it will at the same time mean that nation-state governments are stripped of power. Another Brexiteer claim, dismissed as fantasy, that is coming to fruition. But this will not be limited to the EU. Oh no. The UK Westminster blob will be eyeing this up as a huge opportunity and want to get us into the EU army at the earliest opportunity. Our establishment is in a rush to divest itself of running our armed forces, and they've already run them into the ground in preparation for the handover of the keys to what's left of our tanks, ships and jets to Brussels. So the timing of Tajani's statements, which is, of course, completely unassociated, will be greeted as most fortuitous on defence. And in the UK, the establishment would much rather spend that money elsewhere. So the thinking seems to be that if we all join together under one foreign policy and defence umbrella, all buying our defence kit from the same providers, all using exactly the same equipment and all being trained in the same camp and using fewer people, that we could spend less on defence and save oodles of dosh through economies of scale, therefore having more money for woke projects. And further, with a proper European Army, Navy and Air Force and new member states coming in, there could never ever be a war inside Europe ever again. Well, those would be their arguments anyway. But it does overlook the obvious, that nation-states do all actually have different defence and foreign policy objectives. And in this, the UK has its own unique position. We do not have exactly the same foreign policy and defence requirements as Belgium or Italy, for example. But as Belgium and Italy are part of the ever closer European Union, then their interests will be forced to merge into one over time. Only if the UK were to fully immerse itself back into the EU, together with all its overseas territories, or give those up, would UK defence and foreign policy be united with that of Brussels. And that ain't gonna happen, unless we're bounced in by an unscrupulous government. Now the big questions would be, where will the personnel for such an army come from? Will they all be paid the same? Where would the military bases be? Would each member state be expected to send a set percentage of their working population to keep the numbers in the armed forces up? Or would we end up taking most applicants from the poorer areas of the EU, something that happens in most countries? Can't find work? Then enlist. And which countries would be supplying most of the officers in the higher echelons, the admirals, generals and air marshals? Will the bases be placed strategically or where the work is most needed? Would the French Foreign Legion still be allowed to exist? You get the idea. And an EU army would be quite a large affair, one imagines. So what happens if there are too few applicants to join it? Would there be EU-wide conscription? Remember, some EU states do use conscription already. And our pro-EU blob will want exactly the same for the UK. But the question is, how do you get people to embrace the new EU army? How do you convince the current armed forces personnel and the general population to accept it? Well, that's the easy bit. Do it the EU way. Uplift in pay, especially for those in the higher ranks. Huge building programme for bright shiny new barracks and family quarters. Huge building programme for bright shiny impressive and imposing headquarters buildings. Lots of smart new uniforms and medals. Special shopping malls with low-cost concession outlets in every base, along the lines of the NAFI, but much, much cheaper. Magnificent subsidised food, gyms and swimming pools. That's how you do it. All wrapped in the slogan of a new European covenant for the defenders of freedom. And after years, if not decades, of the running down of armed forces across the EU and the UK, it could just work. Why do you think the UK government is allowing the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, the British Army and the Royal Air Force to be run down? Its accommodation allowed to rot, and the recruitment system made hostile to those who might want to join up. Because a bright, shiny new EU army might start to look attractive, maybe. The UK government will say it can't afford an armed forces. We're broke, they'll wail. But it will find the money to help fully fund an EU armed forces, even if it ends up much more expensive for us in the long run. Be in no doubt.